Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes. We're just waiting for your colleagues to log in, but thank you very much for attending today's session. Just give us a minute or two and we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. We're just waiting for people to log in. My name is Stuart Cohen. I'm the president of IGI Cyber Labs. I want to thank you very much for attending today's session. We're fortunate enough to have Ryan Cloutier here with us today from SecurityStudio, talking about how we can, how small healthcare organizations can take a few simple steps to be more secure. We're going to get started in just a second, but I want to thank everybody for logging in, and we've got people coming into the session now. We're just going to give them another minute or so, and then we'll go ahead and get started. By the way, if you're while you're waiting, if you have any questions you want to make sure we cover, feel free to put them in the chat box, and we'll make sure we get to not only the questions that you pre-submitted, but also the questions that you put in now. So we'll get started in just a minute or two. Thank you. Okay, we've kind of gotten, I would say, critical mass of the people that registered today. So I want to go ahead and get started. I want to thank everybody for attending. My name is Stuart Cohen. I'm the president of IGI Cyber Labs. As those of you that have attended in the past, and if you don't know, this is part of our SMB Thought Leadership Series, designed really as a series of public service announcements to help small business leaders, investors, owners, and keep people in their organizations take the next steps to be a little bit safer, a little bit smarter, and a little bit stronger about the issues that they face around cybersecurity. As always, we want this to be an interactive discussion. So if you have a question, put it in the chat box. If you want to participate in our LinkedIn events, it's a great opportunity for you to ask questions, connect with your peers, and get answers from them specifically. Also, we do these every 2 weeks. I'll talk in a minute about the ones that we have upcoming regarding cyber insurance. But we're doing these on a regular basis. We have one coming up around compliance. We have one coming up as well around getting started with and how an MSP can help you in general. So if you have a topic or you have a presenter you're interested in hearing from, we'd be interested in having you present those to us as well. So here's an example of what we have going forward. I'll talk about the one on the bottom first. We're going to do a session with the folks from Aon and from Cowbell Cyber, talking about how SMB leaders can evaluate and understand cyber insurance. We've gotten a lot of questions about cyber insurance over the last 6 months while we've been doing these sessions, and we want to make sure we get a chance to address those with the small business desk at Aon and the folks at Cowbell that are focused on SMB insurance. And then for people that are interested in a demonstration of Nodeware or to ask an MSP a particular question about how to get support, how to get started, we have our Nodeware live demo and peer Q&A session coming up next week where you can ask those questions as well. Before we get started, I'd like to launch the first poll question so we get a little bit of a feel for the audience. So if you could put that up, please. So we'll put up the results in a second, but you'll see, it's about half and half. Half the people that work for an MSP or own or work for a cybersecurity or technology vendor, and about the other half that own a small business or work at a small business, which will help us as we address the questions that we get to today. So thank you very much for participating in that. Let's move on to today's session specifically. As I said earlier, we are fortunate to have Ryan with us. Ryan is the president of SecurityStudio. They're also a partner with us. He'll talk about the assessment program they have, how they help small businesses, and in this particular case, small healthcare organizations get started. I know we have a poll question specifically around risk assessments that we'd be interested in getting your perspective on. So if we could put up the fourth poll question, if you could answer that, that would be terrific as well. So we'll give that just another second or so, but the kind of the early tally, it's about 2/3 no, 1/3 yes. So it gives everybody a feel for kind of where people are as it relates to a risk assessment. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Ryan. And Ryan has got a couple of slides and a couple of prepared remarks, and then we'll get into our Q&A session.
Thank you, Stuart. Glad to be here. Love talking about this stuff. So I'm really excited to go through a few key issues today, a few key solutions. With a lot of you representing security organizations, you're going to be interacting with small healthcare, and so we'll talk about the issues. We'll talk about the solutions. Just real quick, SecurityStudio. What we do is we provide risk assessment software solutions to manage service providers and businesses that have a risk management function. What we find traditionally is that small healthcare does need a lot of times to work with an outside provider, a managed security provider, or a managed service provider in order to effectively get a security program underway. So I'm going to share with you today some of the common issues that we see in small healthcare settings. This is a little bit of the bad news, if you will, but there's good news that goes along with it. Most of these issues are actually quite easy to resolve for little effort or little financial investment. We like to say that the fundamentals of information security are still overlooked and are still lacking. It's really those basic beginning things that help you get a sound foundation for building an effective, cost-effective cyber program. So probably the biggest issue that we see today in a small healthcare setting is legacy medical hardware and software. A lot of times small healthcare is going to be either in a narrowband specialty, maybe a physical therapy clinic, a pain management clinic, low staff count, generally has older technology in the environment. Or we're going to see it in a rural setting where it's a rural community, it's a smaller community, and again, a lot of times they don't have the budget to keep up with the latest, greatest technological evolutions. So they have this older legacy equipment around. So that's a challenge when it comes to securing it. How do you secure legacy hardware? How do you secure legacy software? Another big concern right now is the evolution of ransomware into what we're now calling wiperware. So wiperware is a type of ransomware that instead of encrypting the information and holding it hostage for ransom, actually destroys the information. It wipes out the database. It wipes out the hard drive. We have seen an increase in that. And so this is one of the things we need to be aware of when we're working with our small healthcare is how resilient are we when, and not if, but when we get hit with either a ransomware or wiperware type of attack. Part of why small healthcare is vulnerable is that we traditionally find infrequent vulnerability management. They're not doing it on a continuous basis. They're maybe doing it once a year. In a lot of cases, they haven't even done it at all. And as our poll showed us earlier, a lot of organizations haven't conducted a risk assessment in the last year. And one of the key components of a risk assessment is a vulnerability scan and a vulnerability assessment. So because we're not managing that in a continuous or constant fashion, we leave ourselves very exposed to that next threat. And I'm sure a lot of you on this call had to deal with Log4j. And one of the things I really like about Nodeware is they were one of the first out of the gate with a free, non-gated tool that you could use to identify if you were impacted by Log4j or not. We fully expect, especially given the current geopolitical climate, that we will see a significant uptick in the next 6 to 12 months in using known vulnerabilities to attack small business. The good news is if you know that that vulnerability exists, there's almost always a fix available. Quick stat for you, 89% of businesses that experienced a security event or a ransomware attack had one or many vulnerabilities that a fix had been published 6 months or longer before the attack. So the vendor put out a fix, the fix just never got applied. So as managed service providers and those that are responsible for securing the small healthcare infrastructure, patching is one of those things. And we'll talk more about that in a second. As our poll showed us, infrequent or no risk assessment at all. So it's very hard to protect what you don't know you have. It's very hard to prioritize your limited time and resources to focus on the most pressing risk to the business, to that small healthcare agency, if you have not gone through identifying what those risks are. The other big challenge we see, and this is true across most small businesses, is we have very limited resources. That could be limited financial resources, that could be limited time resources, in a lot of cases, limited talent resources. Most small healthcare does not have a full-time security professional on staff. And that then takes us to the next bullet point, which is the lack of any kind of formal security program. And when I say formal, I don't mean overly rigorous or mountains of paperwork, but something that is documented and repeatable, something that you can measure. It's very important to be able to measure risk so that you can track your progress in addressing it. Another big growing area of risk and concern is the Internet of Medical Things. So these are smart medical devices, and a lot of times these devices interface with patients. So now we have this health, life, and safety situation. For example, smart IV pumps that are on the network. These things can be hijacked, ransomed, manipulated, and this is a growing concern. So as small healthcare continues to adopt these smart medical devices, we need to be very aware of what risks they present to us and take the appropriate mitigation strategies. The other thing that we see is a lot of times we have complex environments. Small healthcare a lot of times is relying on other outside third parties and other outside medical providers to provide their patient with a total set of care. The most common example that we see is when we talk about radiology. A lot of small healthcare institutions do not have radiologic services on hand. They may have an X-ray machine, but they may not have an actual radiologist on payroll. And so they're using these cloud-hosted services and these outside third-party services. And if we're not securing those things correctly, or if we're not thinking about how implementing that third party affects our risk profile or our infrastructure, we can wind up with a very complex environment. And complexity is the enemy of good security. And the other thing that we see, excuse me, is a very heavy dependence on those third parties and cloud services. And while we in the early days wanted to believe if I put it in the cloud that it was someone else's problem, the harsh reality is you are still 100% responsible and accountable for anything that you're doing with a third party or in the cloud when it comes to patient data, protected health information, any obligations that you have through HIPAA or the Office of Civil Rights. Anything,
Brian,
Stuart, from that?
Before you go on, we did get a question, and it's very it's appropriate for the last bullet. It says, would you agree that moving all apps and the associated data to cloud services with automated backup, DR, and security analytics is a preferred solution both for SMB and for large organizations? And you also might want to comment on what devices are left behind that are IoT devices and Wi-Fi based devices that might still be causing either vulnerability issues or paths to particular critical data.
A great question. So I am not anti-cloud and I am not anti-third party. However, excuse me, we want to make these decisions from an informed perspective. So I'll give you a quick story here. I was working with a client who had used a cloud service for resiliency. They had a vendor, they had an on-prem instance, and then that vendor also provided a cloud-based DR scenario. So in the event something happened on-prem, they could easily spin up an instance in the cloud. Great, we were able to recover quickly. But because we put a overabundance of dependency on that vendor, no one ever checked to see that the check printer or payroll that lived in the building could communicate to that cloud service. And though we wound up in a situation where we were unable to produce paychecks and process payroll because we had not fully integrated. So I don't think it's a good idea to put all your eggs in that basket. I think that there is a lot of benefit to using cloud services for things like disaster recovery and continuity and recoverability and backups. I do encourage you to have multiple backups in multiple services and locations, ideally offline. The big thing to understand is if you do go to the cloud, then make sure that your continuity plan, that your business continuity plan accounts for how you're going to maintain services when that cloud service is not available. The cloud does go down. The cloud will go down again. And when we're talking about human life, we need to be very careful, right? This isn't just finance or anything, this is healthcare. So there are human beings, there are lives that we are directly connected to. And so we have to take those considerations into account whenever choosing an outside service. What was the second piece of that again? Sorry.
Well, Ryan, I think there's a couple of pieces to it. One, I always talk about if you're a business leader or you're an owner or you're an investor in small business, where is your critical data and what's the integrity of the critical data that you have? What devices do you have attached to it that potentially the bad guys could get to it through those devices, some of which are Wi-Fi based, some of which are IoT type devices. It's not just about moving your apps to the cloud. So, maybe you could talk a little bit about the effects of confidentiality and, the integrity of the data and the availability also from a business continuity standpoint as it relates to whether you're on cloud or whether you're in effect on premise.
Absolutely, and great points there that you call out as well. One of the things that we need to be sure of if we are going to move anything to the cloud is what's in our agreement with the vendor. When do we become notified if the vendor has a security event? And we must plan for the fact the vendor will, at some point, have a security event. None of us are immune from this, right? Every one of us will take a turn with dealing with some kind of cyber event. So knowing what's in that contract, making sure that we've accounted for these things, that we're going to be notified, because at the end of the day, we are still responsible for that data. We're still accountable. When it comes to using the cloud, another thing to keep in mind is when we create those connections between our on-prem environment and that cloud environment, that is a two-way connection. So there is the potential that the vendor becomes infected and that in turn passes to us. So what's really important is to make sure we have the appropriate security controls in place to be able to detect when something has happened so that we can respond to it appropriately. As a business leader, when you're thinking about the integrity of this data, protecting this data, and managing cost, again, I go back to what are you going to do if that vendor's not available? What I advise almost all of my clients to do is for your absolutely most critical services, you should have an on-prem instance and then a redundant cloud instance, so that in the event of the loss of the cloud or in the event of the loss of your on-prem, you are still able to provide those most critical services to your business, and able to keep moving forward and providing that patient care.
Great. Do you want to go on to your next slide for a second?
Yeah, let's move it forward here. So let's talk a little bit about solutions. So MFA is a phenomenal low cost, and in some cases no cost, security control that you can put in place today that will dramatically reduce your risk. MFA makes it very hard, not impossible, but very hard and difficult for cybercrime to be successful. Having that extra step, that extra notification, having to put in that extra code can actually reduce your risk by roughly 60%. And now there's a whole piece about how do I get this adopted in my environment and what do I do if my users are resistant. That's another session for another day. But MFA, absolutely minimum requirement at this point. Most insurance carriers now are also mandating at a minimum that you have MFA in place for your administrative staff or any staff that have access to highly sensitive data. The next thing that you should be doing is continuous vulnerability scanning. If you're not doing vulnerability scanning, you are at very, very high risk because you don't know what you don't know. If you're only scanning once a quarter or once a year, you're missing a huge window where vulnerability can exist and you're unaware of it. So continuous vulnerability scanning really is a minimum standard. And we in the industry fully expect by this time next year, it will be a requirement of your insurance carrier as well. They'll come in and say, nope, we know that once a year isn't good enough. We know that once a quarter isn't good enough. We need to see that you are managing this continuously. And the reason this is important is because every day, literal tens of thousands of new vulnerabilities get released. Every day, there are millions of lines of computer code added to the internet, to the application stack. So vulnerabilities are going to exist and we need to be able to effectively identify them and mitigate them. Myself, why I partner with Nodeware, I think they've got the best solution for doing continuous vulnerability scanning in a non-disruptive way. The other thing you want to do is scanning's great, but then what do I do with my results? So establishing a formal vulnerability management program. And again, formal doesn't necessarily mean heavy rigor or tons of process or tons of paperwork, but maybe it's we commit to patch any high or critical vulnerability within 2 weeks or 30 days of its release or discovery, right? But doing that on a schedule, doing that on something that you can count on, that you can measure, very important, because otherwise you could create a situation of potential liability. Not a lawyer, so not giving you legal advice, but one could potentially argue negligence if you knew about a vulnerability and you did not have any documented plan to address it. So having that formal program prevents that from happening. Risk assessment, very important as well. Risk assessment is part of figuring out where your biggest risk is so that you can start to plan for how you're going to address it, how you're going to mitigate it. So if you don't have that clean picture of what your risks are, it's very difficult to defend the organization. And all risk assessments should have some type of quantifiable measure. So what, SecurityStudio would love it if you use ours. Check us out, it's pretty simple. We keep it very simple, very easy, very actionable. But no matter who you go with, you should do a risk assessment, but make sure that that risk assessment has some unit of measure so that you can start to quantify this and plan, and most importantly, show progress towards reducing risk. These are the things that keep you insurable and defensible. Another low cost, not necessarily easy to implement, but low cost to implement, is getting more aggressive with controlling the firewall rules. A lot of organizations have done a fairly decent job of controlling inbound traffic, but in my experience, most organizations today are still not doing a good job on controlling the outbound traffic or the egress traffic. And the reason this is important is any successful cyber attack requires a round trip connection. So the phishing email comes in and the link gets clicked. And when that happens, a command goes out through the firewall back to the bad guy to give them control. So if we know what applications we have and how they behave, we can actually restrict quite tightly on the firewall what's allowed to leave and go out to the internet. And the better we control our firewall rules, and the more tightly we do that, the less likely we are to have a successful cyber attack impact us. Another solution here, managed security services. Work with an MSP. If you're a small healthcare today and you don't have somebody on staff who's a bona fide security professional, you need to consider hiring one in. What most small healthcare will find is that a fractional CISO, a virtual CISO, or a managed security service can provide the level of expertise you need at a price point that's palatable to you. Just to give you a ballpark idea, a CISO, a full-time CISO today is going to run you between $300,000 and $500,000 a year, and that's before bonuses and incentives and all these other things. But a fractional CISO you can pick up for a few grand. And a lot of times that the advice and guidance that CISO is going to give you, or that managed security service provider or managed service provider is going to give you, generates a several months worth of work effort. So it's a very cost-effective way for you to make sure you're getting good expertise, that you have a security professional in your corner helping to keep you secure without having to increase your staffing or try to find a security professional and recruit them away from another company.
Hey, Brian,
yep.
Before you move on to that, we got a question that's obviously from an MSP that says, how do I deal with clients who I know are not compliant, but they think they are?
Oh, this is a great question. So what we're going to talk about for a second here is efficacy of consulting. So if a client believes that they're doing the things they need to be compliant, and you as the provider feel other about that, what we need to do is start with some kind of quantifiable measure. So great, you're compliant. I don't want to distrust you, but now we need to prove that. We need to show that. How are we going to measure that? Have we done a risk assessment against our compliance? Can we show that we have done the things that we think we have done? And if the client is resistant, most of the time it's because they don't fully understand what you're trying to communicate. I encourage everyone in IT, when dealing with non-IT people, to speak the language of that person, to speak human as much as you can and not tech. A lot of times we use tech terms and tech words, and no one wants to feel dumb. And so if they don't understand it, they'll kind of nod along with you, but they don't really know what you're saying. So if you're struggling to get them on the same page as you, re-look at how you're approaching the problem and what is the dialogue around this problem. That usually will help solve it. And if that doesn't, and you truly are in a situation where the client is adamant that they're compliant and you're 100% sure they're not, and you cannot meet in the middle, that may be an opportunity to look at perhaps not having them as a client. They clearly are stuck in a mindset, and that won't change. But we think generally that's a very rare occurrence. It's usually just a change in dialogue and a representing of the information in a different way. vCISO services or certified vCISO services, right? These can help you out a lot. Now, this could be in partnership with an MSP. This could be a separate piece. I'm a vCISO to several organizations who have managed service providers, and I'm brought in as that outside neutral third party to make sure the managed service provider is actually meeting the security requirements that they've said they have. I also act as an arbitrator for any conflicts between the managed service provider and the business itself. Because I am that neutral third party, I'm able to do that effectively. So there's a lot of value in having somebody like that on a retainer.
Ryan, it's interesting you say that, because when we formed IGI Cyber Labs, the whole intention was to get Nodeware separate and distinct from the other subsidiary, IGI Cybersecurity Services, which provides all of the traditional IT and consulting services. But one of the things we found in the last few months, as compliance has moved more from vulnerability management to vulnerability program management, we are now having some of our MSP partners requesting our services people do a third-party independent risk assessment or a third-party independent pen test in order to allow then the MSP to be able to provide not only value-added services, but recommendations where it's not their results providing their proposals, if you will.
And that's a very important thing to do because, you know, at the end of the day, you do need to verify things, right? Trust is great, but verify is better. If the fox is watching the hen house, are you 100% sure it's going well? So I encourage everyone to have an outside independent third party without a dog in the fight take a look at the security posture of you and your vendors and your service providers, right? Have that the outside view because, you know, again, we put a lot of trust in these providers and most of them are doing great, but in some cases they themselves don't know what their own risk profile is. So I definitely, Stuart, I think that's going to increase. I think you're going to get more of those calls every day. And I think that's going to be a main focus over the next 24 months is going back and verifying, are we actually getting what we think we are? Are we truly as secure as we think we are? Now, another area, is there another question?
There's a question about employee security training and dark web monitoring.
So employee security training is an interesting one. Traditional security awareness training creates awareness, but I can tell you I'm aware of many things that I don't care about. And so what organizations should be focused on is not pushing through some slide deck content and giving a survey at the end that they can change answers on until they get a pass, but instead start taking a holistic approach to culture. How do you create an, excuse me, how do you create an active defender from your employees? And what we have found is the most successful way to do that is not to talk about security in a context of a work setting with technical terms, but to ask them questions about how they're protecting themselves and their family from cybercrime. Because the same habits that they'll practice at home to make sure those family photos are secure and safe, that the bank account is secure and safe, that the kids are safe online, these same habits and practices carry back into the business. Very few of us take our work to our dinner table. Most of us will take our dinner table to work. So it's that paradigm shift. Now, SecurityStudio does have a free personal risk assessment. We'll get you the link in the chat here in a minute. It is s2me.io. And for managed service providers and businesses, we actually have a commercial version of that that allows you to assess the efficacy of this awareness training the staff has already received. But to boil that out to a very simple phrase, it's about building personal connection and culture. And the more effective you are at that, the better that awareness and participation from those employees is going to be. The other thing is take an incentivized program versus a punitive. I worked with an organization that was struggling with employee awareness. And so what we did is we said, okay, whichever department reports the most phishing emails at the end of each week gets a $5 gift card to Starbucks. I have never seen so many well-paid grown adults work so hard to get a $5 gift card to Starbucks in all my days. Well, what that organization experienced over the next few weeks was a significant reduction in phishing clicks and a significant increase in phishing reports. So I could do a whole session on that. That's its own thing, but start with, you know, personal connection. Start talking about this in the context of digital life skills, in at-home safety, and less about protecting company data, and you will see a change in your employee behavior.
So we got a question about PHI security and disposition of data. Do you want to spend a minute talking about that and how and what an MSP's role can be in that?
Yeah, so data security and data disposition, right? And really the whole life cycle of PHI. MSPs can play a very valuable role here. Most organizations don't have the capability or the time to truly do data classification and discovery, which is step one of one, right? We have to know where this stuff lives. And now a fair amount of it's going to live in a healthcare system, say like Epic. But believe it or not, there are tons of spreadsheets in Google Drives and Amazon Drives and the doctor's local laptop that are full of PHI. And a lot of times we don't consider that when we're doing our data classification. So there are products and services that MSPs can partner with and purchase that will give them the technical capability to assist that small healthcare with that discovery process. So step one of any kind of security around the data starts with assessing and discovery, and then classification, organization. Now, when it comes to data destruction and disposition of data, the small healthcare and really most businesses, even large enterprises, still struggle with doing that in a secure manner. I'll point you to the NIST 888. It's a great guideline on the appropriate ways to sanitize, destroy, purge, the various types of ways that data can be disposed of in a secure manner, and it gives you a great set of guidance. If you are working with an outside party who provides those services to you, make sure that they're doing it consistent to the NIST 888 and they're providing you attestation. As a hacker, if you will, right? As a good guy, security guy, if I want to get data, there's 3 really easy ways to do it, and the most easy way is to go to eBay and buy a used laptop, because a lot of times those hard drives are unencrypted and they are stuffed full of data. So it's very important not just to think about how you're managing the data during its life cycle, but also what happens to that equipment after it is retired or expired. Where does it go? How do we do that? And I do think there is a vast opportunity that's yet to be tapped for MSPs to assist the clients they serve with this data discovery, classification, and ultimately data security strategy. Which segues me to my next bullet point, which is policy. So a lot of times we lack policy. Good news for you, if you go to SecurityStudio's website, go to our resources tab, we give you the top policies in template form, ready to go with no gated email. You don't have to give me your email, just go get it and start using it. And anyone on this call today that does not have a policy set, either for yourself or your clients, please go grab ours. World-class, enterprise grade, in use by thousands of companies worldwide today. That's just something we do to support our mission before money initiative. But make sure that policy is right-sized for the organization. The worst thing you can do is create an overly heavyweight policy that doesn't actually get adopted, doesn't actually get adhered to. It is far better to start small and simple and something that's effective and right-sized for the organization, and then mature from there. And the last piece here, and this is another area where I really think MSPs are missing a great opportunity to create revenue, is around third-party and vendor risk management. Most of the organizations that we're referring to when we're talking about small healthcare do not have the capability in-house to do appropriate vendor risk management. Vendor risk management is critical. 89% of data breaches last year, direct result of a third party. So it wasn't the organization itself, it was one of their vendors. So it's so important to do this. And again, if we're thinking about what's coming, we also fully expect by mid-year next year, this will be a minimum requirement for insurance coverage if you're getting cyber liability insurance. They're gonna wanna know that you've assessed your vendors. So what MSPs can do is look at creating a virtual vendor risk management program. And not here to sales pitch you too hard. We have a S2 vendor product that is perfectly suited for that exact scenario for MSPs to use. Very cost effective, lots of margin, and any vendor in our system, as long as they consent to it, you can reuse their results, which reduces the amount of time and effort that you spend and that your client spends on identifying and managing vendor risk. And these are kind of the big ones. And if you hit these, you're actually doing really good from a security program perspective. You will have moved the needle quite far from disaster waiting to happen to when the disaster happens, we are absolutely ready to respond.
So we got a question. You mentioned the free tool, and they say they're hesitant about using a free tool for fear of its security risks. I assuming you're talking about a free tool from SecurityStudio.
That is correct.
Not a free tool as in open source.
Right. Now, open source can be a viable solution, but do your due diligence. Now, in the case of the tool I'm referring to, which is the S2Me, and I'll put that link in the chat now, that tool is very secure. And what we've done with that and the way that we handle that information and store it, built by security professionals, so it was secure by design at the onset. And the way that we manage privacy, we're very, very tightly controlled, and anybody that wants those details, reach out to me, I'll give you an NDA, and then we actually get the meat and potatoes. But yes, open source can be helpful, but make sure you understand what is in that open source. For example, a lot of times commercial software as well will use open source. A lot of us don't know this, that we're paying for commercial software that is built on open source modules. So understanding what's in the soup or the stew, if you will, of these applications, whether they're open source or CODIS or commercial off the shelf, is a very important part to managing our risk. So free doesn't automatically mean bad, but know what's in it, know what libraries it's calling. That's why Log4j was such a big deal, was because so many organizations had leveraged an open source thing in their commercial software. And when that vulnerability was exposed, it became a mad dash. Many organizations, well, very well known, very large organizations were struggling to pick up the pieces because they themselves weren't fully aware of all the ingredients in their software or solution.
So we got another question about what are some of the best ways to get small practices or organizations to adopt a security mindset, maybe when they don't have a full-time IT person or a full-time security person, or maybe they have somebody who may not be terribly well respected in the organization that's just providing some desktop support, and now it's about taking the next step.
So for me, it always starts with going to the top, right, and understanding what they think their position of risk and exposure is. Right now, the biggest card you have in your deck to play is insurance coverage. Thankfully, the insurance industry has really stepped up their requirements. It is driving things, right? It is causing folks to have to do something that they kind of said, nah, we're not going to get hit. We're not going to get hit. We don't have to worry about that. That argument is dying fast. So this is an opportunity to re-engage. And really what you want to focus on is making sure that you're able to deal with this when this happens. Buildings have sprinkler systems. We don't complain about it. We don't, argue about it. They're there not because we're in fear the building's going to burn down every minute of the day, but because we've realized fire can happen. Fire will happen. And so we just need to be prepared. So again, I go back to use non-technical approaches and non-technical analogies to really explain why this is valuable to the business, how this is not a cost, but is a business enhancement. I have a saying I like to use. Companies that put protection before profit, not in place or instead, but before profit, are the companies that will be most profitable in the end. Companies that only focus on profit and skip over protection will most likely go out of business. I'll give you another quick stat. 60% of small business that experiences a significant cybersecurity attack, either ransomware or wiperware or just DDoS, whatever, a significant attack, goes out of business within 6 months. So you're actually investing in the future of your business by doing this now and doing this the right way.
So I got a question of how do I talk to my boss if he's not interested in taking the first few steps to be more secure?
So a couple ways to deal with this. Depending on the culture and the politics, that you got to understand the land you stand on. But generally what I will do if I'm dealing with a resistant leader, because it's not my job to make that decision for them, right? That's their decision. My job is to say, this is the risk. This is the impact of that risk in business context, not technical context. And then to implement whatever decision they make to the best of their ability. So one technique that I have is to say, totally cool, I get it, but I need you to sign this risk acceptance form. I need you to sign this piece of paper that says you're taking ownership over this decision to not do this. So that when the thing happens, my head's not the one to roll. People aren't coming running to me. I'm not the one getting deposed to be part of the lawsuit because I said, I don't think this is a good idea, but it's not my job to make that decision. You say, I don't care, I'm gonna do it anyways. I don't want to do security, fine, but I need you to document this. And if you still can't get that traction, my advice, find somewhere else to work. Start looking for a new job. I would not spend 1 minute of my time with a company that doesn't understand that this is important. It might not be the most important focus they have, but it should be part of the company's focus, because if it's not, that company's not going to exist very long anyways.
I always every time I talk to a business leader, a small business owner, or an investor, I always say, you're focused on running your business and you're focused on growing your business and making your business profitable and returning investment to your investors. But, the integrity of your data is critically important. The integrity of the confidentiality of your systems is terribly important. And if, God forbid, you get attacked, the business continuity to come back and recover quickly is critically important, not only to you, but to your employees, to your customers, and to your investors. So I always say, what are a couple of things you could do to make yourself safer and smarter and stronger while still spending, 99% of your time running your business?
Exactly, and that's where partners help, right? That's where managed service provider is very helpful. The other thing that I would add to that is in 2022 going into 23, you're going to struggle really hard to explain how that decision wasn't grossly negligent. You're really going to struggle. It's well known that cyber attacks exist. It's well known that businesses need to do things. I'll point you to the Federal Trade Commission. The Federal Trade Commission has taken a pretty aggressive stance on what businesses need to be doing to protect their customers, and failure to do so could run afoul of the law. So you could have civil or criminal issues on your hands if you don't start doing something. The nice thing is, at least today, doing anything, something that moves that needle, is still considered defensible. But I can guarantee you, in action, you're going to have a really, really tough time defending that.
So we have another poll question about how many people are using an MSP. I think it'd be appropriate to put that up there now, so we can get a feel for the audience from that standpoint. So if you could spend a second answering that question. So we're just about up to half the people voting. We'll just wait for another second or two, and then we'll go from there. Okay, if we could put up the results. So great, interesting. I don't know, Rich, Ryan, if you want to make a couple of observations as it relates to this first, or I can.
Yeah, so I think these results kind of tell me a couple things. It's interesting to see basically a clean split between not sure or other, or we're handling it ourselves. Handling it yourself is not a problem if you have the appropriate staff, tooling, asset inventories, response plans, etc. And the program is formalized and you have leadership support for it. If you're staffed appropriately, absolutely no problem in doing that. I still do encourage you, though, to occasionally bring in that outsider to take a look and make sure everything is the way you think it is. For those that are unsure or don't know, it's time to call somebody in to have them take a look. If you as a business leader don't know, go find your tech person, have a talk with them. If you don't have a tech person, maybe start reaching out to some MSPs to find out exactly what is what. And again, just because you're in the cloud doesn't leave you free of obligation. So, I've heard businesses go, well, we're just Office 365 and everything we do is in the cloud, and we use, these 3 SaaS-based solutions, and we don't have anything on-prem. Well, you do. And are you using those solutions securely? Microsoft takes absolutely no responsibility whatsoever for the security of your things. They take responsibility for the security of their things, but read your user agreement. It's very crystal clear. You still have obligations. If you don't turn MFA on, that's not their problem. That's your problem. So if you're not sure, that for me means it's time for a risk assessment and a conversation. You should be very sure what and who and how this is happening. And for those internal teams, if you're not at a maturity level that allows you to independently react and respond, you may want to consider augmenting some of your internal services with outside assistance. This could come in the form of incident response retainers. Most of us don't keep a forensics expert on staff. You may need that expert. The other thing is no matter where you're at in the spectrum, if you have cyber liability insurance, make sure you're very clear on the requirements of when to notify and involve your insurer, and make sure you're very clear on what your insurer expects you to take for next steps. Some insurance providers require you to work with certain companies, and they will not accept you working with anybody else. So if you call your friend and you're like, hey man, come help us out, and then when that bill arrives, you go to the insurance company, they're very most likely going to deny that because it wasn't part of their approved list of vendors that they work with.
While we're going to have the last poll question put up, but it reminds me a little bit of the conversation we were having with a local, not local, but a university where they moved everything to the cloud, yet they still had hundreds and thousands of cameras and doorbells and different devices on campus that were all part of their Wi-Fi and IoT networks that they weren't really concerned about. And I always bring up the example of the Bellagio and the fish tank and the thermometer that wasn't updated, and that's how the Bellagio ended up getting scammed out of a ton of money from a ransomware attack because of the fish tank, the thermometer getting to critical data. So I only bring that up as an example of, while the apps might be in the cloud, there's a lot of Wi-Fi, a lot of IoT devices, and we see a lot of people that used to just put an agent on a corporate device when people are working at home. Now they're doing a lot more with sensors to keeping track of their home Wi-Fis of their executives and their key people to make sure if they've got access to critical data, the sensor is looking at it.
Absolutely, and you should. I mean, I'll finish with this last quick story. My neighbor, their child is a cyber savvy child. Well, they were doing things on the home network that were impacting the work computer. And we don't think about these things, right? We're not thinking that our children potentially could be a threat to the business, because who wants to think about their kids that way? And it wasn't that the kid was malicious, the kid was curious, but they were using tools and technologies above their knowledge level, and without realizing, while they were trying to hack their PlayStation, that they were also hacking dad's work computer. And it actually caused quite a bit of stir, and thankfully that particular business was using sensors and was using agents and was able to detect that right away. But it's not always outside people. The last thing I'll say here is, insiders are still a thing. We still have to look at the people inside the organization as well. And given the highly charged political climate that we have right now, and the divisiveness around mandates or no mandates or this or that, or whichever way you lean on a topic, we are seeing bad guys now go to Glassdoor and find your most disgruntled employee and offer them half the ransom if they give up their credentials. So it's never been more important than now to monitor continuously what is going on, what is in the environment, what's happening. Why is that login happening at 3 o'clock in the morning from China when we don't have any employees in China?
We tell our MSP partners, if you have a prospect that you're talking to, in a couple of minutes, you ought to be able to determine whether they're an opportunity for you or not, just by asking them, do you know when a new device shows up on the network, and do you care? And do you know what devices are vulnerable to your critical data, and do you care? And depending upon the answers to those two questions, gives our MSP partners the opportunity to very quickly talk to a small organization, to a small business, to a small healthcare about that exact problem, right? And how do they help them with multi-factor authentication? How do they help them with some initial education? How do they help them with, the beginnings of a vulnerability management program management, not only to meet, the NIST framework for stage 1 data gathering and CIS 18, but also to get them on the road to output that they can use for cyber insurance, for cyber liability, and et cetera.
Definitely, and part of this is preparing for the future, right? This isn't going away. This challenge, this issue, and you will see in the coming weeks, given what's happening in the world today, I absolutely expect the amount of attacks to increase substantially. I expect more small businesses to be targeted, especially healthcare and other small critical infrastructure type businesses, municipal water supplies, so for those of you that are MSPs that are serving a variety of verticals, now's the time to start having those conversations because CISA just put out an emergency announcement last night about these things, right? And so if the federal government is highly concerned, generally I'm going to get a little bit more concerned myself. And just based on what we're hearing, what we're seeing, absolutely we expect attacks against small business, small healthcare, small critical infrastructure to ramp up exponentially in the next even 90 days. So now's the time.
Perfect. Well, we've got a couple of things coming up, as you can see here on the screen. If you're interested in hearing more about cyber insurance, how to evaluate it, how to understand it, we have a session coming up on March 10th. Once again, the folks from the small business desk of Aon, as well as Dan from Cowbell Cyber Insurance will be on. That'll be on the 10th. And if you have any questions specifically about Nodeware or other questions for Ryan or one of our MSP partners, feel free to join the live demo with peer Q&A on March 3rd, and you can get any of those questions answered. As always, you could submit questions in advance. You don't have to be on live. We'll address your questions, and then you can watch the results on the YouTube channel, and you can see all the output from it. So we allow you to participate early, participate live, or to go to YouTube after the fact and watch the recap. So with that, I want to just, Ryan, give you a chance to kind of wrap up. We've got a couple of minutes. Anything specific you want to talk about? And then I've got a couple of closing remarks.
Yeah, I'll wrap up with this. 3 things you can do right now that will help you and anyone you serve. Start having conversations that are based in human things, not tech things. Make this stuff relatable, use analogies, examples, work to understand what they care most about and find a way to tie the topic to that. That will help you with your awareness, with your participation, with buy-in, with leadership support, budget, all these things. Second thing, if you have not done a risk assessment, if you are not doing vulnerability management or your clients are not, for Pete's sake, get that started, because the outputs of that is work that has to be done. Work that the sooner you start this, the sooner you can get to addressing that stuff, the faster you're going to reduce that risk, because the time between now and then is a big window of opportunity to fall victim to cybercrime. And the third thing is do something. Once a week, something should be moving forward, even if it's minor, even if it's, hey, we created a draft of a policy and we're talking about it. Do something, because doing nothing is not defensible, and you're not going to have a good time getting the insurance company to pay. Insurance companies are looking for ways not to pay. They're looking for ways to reduce their liability and increase yours, because that's their business, right? They're not in business to cut every check every day. They're in business to make money, just like all of us. So do those 3 things, right? It's a people game. So that's what I'll end with. Back to you, Mr. Stewart.
Yeah, I would just say, there's a lot of hype. There's a lot of commercials. There's a lot of materials around enterprise risk management. Enterprise risk management is great. It is wonderful. It's terrific. But you need a general counsel. You need a chief privacy officer. You need a chief risk officer. You need a CIO. You need a CISO. If you're an organization that has all those things, then an enterprise risk management solution is what you need. 2.3 million small businesses in the United States between 5 employees and 500 employees don't have any of those organizational titles in place. They need to take a couple of simple steps. And taking a couple of simple steps around multi-factor authentication, around understanding what devices you have that are exploitable, and understanding, do you want to just move those devices away from critical data? You don't necessarily even have to fix them. You just have to move those devices away from critical data, and that's okay. Or, you could do some basic education. This is about making SMB leaders and investors and owners, let them do their business, let them run their business, let them focus on growing and organizing their business accordingly, not transitioning to cyber. So I tell people all the time, let people focus on their business, let them go from there. That's what these public service announcements are all about. I appreciate everybody coming today, taking the time to ask the questions, participating in the discussion. The charts will be on our YouTube channel as well as the recording early next week. We've got the other sessions coming up next week. We continue to do these about twice a month. So if there's a particular topic or a particular speaker that you're interested in, that you would like to have us on these public service announcements, or you'd like to present yourself, please contact us. We're interested in making, all SMB leaders safer and stronger, and anything we can do, we want to do to help that. And then connecting them with MSPs to provide local support and assistance. So with that, I want to thank everybody for their time. Ryan, I want to thank you for your time, and everybody have a great afternoon and a great weekend.
Thanks, everyone.